Howdy, folks. My name is Lee. I am with Follow the Leader. This is a Follow the Leader production where I share information and knowledge either from my graduate program, from my travels, or any of my enjoyable reading with you in lecture material and in lecture style. I am a University of Texas at Austin presidential scholar, as well as in the middle of my master's in theological studies graduate program, and I have a passion for teaching, for learning, and for educating. Here we are going to be talking about the Scottish witch hunts of the 1500s and through the 1700s. Now, all of this material will be on my website as well, so you feel resonate. If it resonates with you, you can download and share to your local communities. I have source lists as well as a book list at the end for more reading. Let's get into it. So, as we go through this introduction, we will dive right into the context of Scotland. What was going on with its geography, the cultures, the religious upheaval, the political rivalries going on. With the witch hunts themselves, who was hunted? Why were they hunted? The accusations and the torture these women experienced, and the end of the hunts. We'll talk a little bit about the impact on culture, including the Salem witch trials and cultural significance up to modern day. Then finally, we will wrap up. I did save the timeline for the very end because it does take a little bit to go through. So I just put it at the end. And if you are watching on YouTube, you can just pause and look at each individual timeline slide. Again, all sources will be listed at the end. And let's get into it. So the Scottish witch hunts of the 1500s to the 1700s were carried out by religious leaders in power who used their interpretation of scripture, law, and justice, along with personal vendettas, to legally jail, torture, assault, and kill, range from estimates as low as 4,000 to as high as 8,000 women accused of witchcraft. The hunts occurred during a time of religious and social unrest, where the competition for power fostered an environment of fear, tribalism, and scapegoating. When you walk away from this, I hope that you have a better understanding of what was going on with the Scottish witch hunts and that you understand the motivations and methodologies employed by the Scottish witch hunters, and that the legacy of the Scottish witch hunts has impacted our culture today. Now, here is a video of Scotland. I went to Scotland this past year. I spent about 9 days solo traveling by train. As you can see, it is foggy, it is cloudy, lots of green, kind of gloomy, very gloomy, and just ripe, just perfect for the mythical, the magical, the mystical to really play a role in their culture. In fact, this part of the video that you're looking at right now, this beautiful church, actually, some witches were, we'll get into that, but was actually designed by the same person who did the English red telephone booths. So, very cool. Where in the world is Scotland? So, Scotland sits pretty far north. As you can see, it's probably right in line with Newfoundland, but significantly far north, especially compared to the United States, where I am currently living. It sits right under Norway, just to the west of it, and is surrounded, except for its southern bit, by water. Now, in comparison to the rest of Europe, and I really want to draw attention to Scotland's placement in comparison to Rome, Italy, down there, because we are going to be talking about the Catholic Church and why geography plays a role in the Protestant Reformation, specifically in the United Kingdom, right? Their geography, they are far away from not only Rome and Italy and the Vatican, but island nations, island countries, and isolated areas tend to develop their own sort of cultures. They're, even if they are quote unquote European, they all have their own thing going on, and that is no different than Scotland, which sits pretty far north away from everybody. Now, the hunts themselves were not something that were backwoods. These were carried out in major urban, economic, educated areas where a lot of the population was condensed. There was a lot of question about social morale. It wasn't so big in the Highlands, though there was some of that, but really the heart of this were all in areas that were highly populated. Scotland makes up, as I said, that northern portion of the island of Great Britain. It is isolated and influenced by trade. Very so, whether it's the Vikings or the Icelandic trade, um, they're kind of doing their own thing, which gives it a lot of influence. Now, of course, mainland Europe also has its own influences, but again, the further away you get from folks, the more sort of individualistic you get with how you conduct your society. Again, Scotland is pretty far north, so they've got that long summer daylight, that short winter daylight. Everything was ran by candlelight back in the day. Eyeglasses were not mainstream, and there was no electricity. So you got that fog, you got that cloudiness. In fact, eyeglasses, once they went mainstream, there was a significant drop in reports of magical sightings. So I'll let you sit with that for a minute. But yes, the it was dark. It was gloomy all the time. Not all the time, but most of the time. Predominantly, the people of Scotland were farmers, hunters, sheep herders, whalers, or anglers. Um, this was right as the Protestant Reformation and the academic rise of academia, the Enlightenment was starting to emerge. So most people were not literate. And if they were literate and educated, they were probably men who were wealthy and predominantly Christian. And again, at the time, or right as this was emerging, most folks were Catholic. The Protestant Reformation is unfolding here, and we will get into that. But again, just kind of the lay of the land. Everybody worked on the land in the cloudy and the foggy, and again in the dark with very little education or literacy. So Scotland itself had been Christianized by 800 AD. They were Catholic dominant because that was the superpower at the time, Catholicism. We'll get into that in the next slide, but Catholicism had crossed into Scotland. We know a little bit about the Celts, but we won't speak on this one. This will be for another lecture going into Celtic and Christian history. But what is interesting is Catholicism does have a tendency to allow for the mystical and the magical. Even amongst Catholics, there is a beautiful mystic part of Catholicism. And so while there were those that were considered pagan, there was an openness to healers or clairvoyants or vision people, folks that had stronger intuition or sensitive or what could be considered magical powers. The Protestant Reformation was a significant departure of the power and shift away from Italy and Catholicism to individual countries. Italy basically ran everything. The Catholic Church was seated down there, and from there, they were able to pretty much dominate most of Europe. Again, that academia was rising and was coming from mainland Europe. This enlightenment, this emphasis on academia and education and books and science. And there was a sort of kind of growing clash of magic. Now, not at this point. In fact, it was the academia, the education, and that started, right, all these wealthy Christian men going across, studying abroad, exchanging stories about witchcraft and coming home and um, essentially wanting to go on these crusades. The witch hunts were not specific to Scotland, they were happening in mainland Europe, um, but the per capita killings of those who were identified as witches was higher in Scotland by a landslide. Furthermore, this was back in kingdom times. There were a lot of inner conflicts amongst petty kingdoms and bloodlines. You had foreign threats. The world was just as dramatic then as it is now, and lots of politics. So lots going on during this time in Scotland. Anyway, there was also a second wave of the bubonic plague, which was affecting not only the people and the working population, but also a famine. And between the famine, the plague, and all these political crises going on around them, these people were really looking for somewhere to put their anger, somewhere to blame, some sort of distraction from the things that they felt they did have power over. So, this note about 1500s Catholicism. Catholicism was the most powerful force in Western Europe. They're seated at the Vatican in Italy. They're one of the largest landowners in the world. I think the largest landowner in the world now, privately, might be McDonald's or Subway or something like that. They have so many different locations, but certainly Catholicism was dominant. They had a massive influence on followers' morals and behaviors. And if you didn't align or if you spoke out, you could be excommunicated, you could be demonized, you could be seen as, a heretic and cast out of your society. It was very much our way or get out. The Bible at this point was written in Latin and had been for a few hundred years, meaning again these literacy rates, the Bible in Latin, um, kind of tells us or shows us that for the majority of Christian history, the followers had no idea what was in that Bible. They just trusted the bishops, they trusted their priests and ministers because they couldn't read to go and figure that out. But that was very common. Lots of stories were passed around with oral storytelling. But yes, there was, even if you could read, you would also have to know how to read Latin in addition to whatever your normal language was. Catholic, the Catholic Church was not just powerful in its influence on society, but they drew taxes from kingdoms and parishes. They were making hand over fist, superseding the powers of the kings who didn't quite like sending off money and having influence from, someone that's not in their country, that's not in their kingdom, and it's certainly not their king. And through all of that money, through all of that bureaucratic leadership, there was extreme corruption amongst leadership and bishops. Again, those kings had to ultimately answer to the Pope. A pope was the one that called for the Crusades, which is crazy to think about now. Imagine a religious leader in a foreign country drawing up your troops to go on a crusade for Christianity. It's a little skeezy when you start thinking about who is in control. So we have religious pluralism as a fallout of the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation, literally protest, was protesting the Catholic Church. Many countries, right roughly at the same time, began to get very sick of the Catholic Church having these sort of powers and these corruptions and all this money. And with all these protests and departure away from the Catholic Church, it created a power vacuum. Who is Protestant? Who is Christian? Who gets to say they're in charge? And here, specifically in Scotland, we have the Calvinists. That is kind of an underlying, very strict, very like conservative, if you will. Um, they were made up with different groups of Presbyterians and Puritans. They all have the same similar underlying beliefs. They had different approaches to their beliefs. That's why they're separate groups. But they strongly believed in a decentralized government. They wanted each church to basically run itself and not have to answer to anything else. On the other side, you have the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church. This was basically Catholicism 2.0. And we'll talk about how that unfolded here in just a bit. But these are the two groups. We have the Presbyterian Calvinist Puritans who wanted total local control, and then you had the English and Scottish royalty who said, you know what, Catholicism wasn't really the problem. The problem was that nobody was answering to me and paying money to me. So we're going to keep basically everything, and we're going to keep this uh, godly state. We are going to keep the official Church of Scotland and England under this Anglican Church or Episcopal Church, Episcopal meaning bishop led. So, this Protestant Reformation, this Protestant versus Catholicism, is not about theology. It really wasn't too much about Jesus or miracles or the Bible or, going to Mass or communion. This was really about power. Who gets to say who's running what? Who gets to say where the money's going? This was very much an institutional issue. There was a lot of corruption, as I said. Um, but again, this wasn't trying to be necessarily a new religion. Some denominations have formed from this, but really the kingdoms of Scotland and England were looking to keep Catholicism kind of as is, but rename it so that they were the ones in control. Now, this all started with King Henry VIII in Great Britain. There was Martin Luther over in Germany. There's a few other folks in mainland Europe, but for the point of this lecture, we're going to talk about King Henry VIII and his claim to throne and his desire to go against the Catholic Church and form his own Anglican English Episcopal Church. He becomes the head of state and church as soon as he walks all of England and Scotland away from Catholicism. So his bloodline later on down the road is Queen Elizabeth, and she takes the English throne. Mary, Queen of Scots, is also his bloodline and cousins to Queen Elizabeth, England. So you got King Henry, who walked all of the Great Britain away from Catholicism, and then you've got Queen Elizabeth that would take over England, and her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, who would take over Scotland. So we've already got some royal family drama brewing. They were separate kingdoms, both concerned that the other one would overtake the other. Now, James VI is born to Mary, Queen of Scots. He's coronated at birth, and he achieves power at age 12. Can you imagine answering to a 12-year-old if you were on the King's Council? Mary, Queen of Scots, deserves a whole lecture on her own, but her claim to the throne was constantly being threatened, and she did do a lot of abandoning or traveling or just trying to move around. So there's quite a bit of James not really feeling safe under his own mother, being raised by other people, feeling very vengeful and very paranoid of the claim to throne of Scotland, even by the age of 12. He is made the head of state of Scotland, or the church, which they call the Kirk. This is the same King James I. He would later go on to take over England and unite it under Great Britain. He was the author, the overseer of the King James Version of the Bible. So everything we'll be talking about today primarily came out of the justification by King James in the King James Version of the Bible. He eventually does leave Scotland and takes his throne in England, and that did create quite a power vacuum. Unfortunately, he did witness his mother become beheaded by his own great aunt, I believe is what Queen Elizabeth would have been. But yes, he watched his mother be beheaded by his mother's cousin, all in the name of royal family, bloodline, greed, power. So as you can imagine, this man grew up reputably paranoid. After witnessing and growing up in the heart of royalty and politics, just was not at all very secure in either keeping power or who his threats were, just really, truly, reputably paranoid. He did become the head of church, or the kirk, and the state, and he led through bishops and clergy structure. So, again, very similar to what the Catholics were doing. He just took it over after his great grand uncle. You would have to go back in, but his bloodline was the one to leave the Catholic Church and basically do 2.0 as the English Church, the Anglican Church, and now he is running it. At some point, he sends away ships to go and retrieve Queen Anne of Denmark. He was very that is how they were going to keep unity in kingdoms. If he, were to marry Denmark, then Denmark would be an ally. There was already an existing belief, as I said, from the Catholic Church, their mysticism, but also the Celts and the Druids. They already had a lot of magical healing beliefs built into their system, that folk tradition. And so this wasn't something new that anything came up. But again, you take magic with someone paranoid, and that paranoid man sends off ships to go and retrieve his wife, and they have to go on 3 different sailing missions because of bad storms. Well, he's going to start blaming witches. So that is his first real claim to witchcraft. I'm sure that there was more just in watching the politics of his life unfold, but this is where we see King James VI have a personal stake. He's trying to get his wife. There are really bad storms along the North Sea, and he can't get her, and he blames it on witches. When he returns, there are the trials of New Brunswick, which were a lot of noblemen, and they were being accused of witchcraft and magic and all sorts of anti-Christian powers. And he got to witness firsthand in the political realm how the accusation of witchcraft could greatly take away someone's power and influence and hurt their reputation amongst nobles, including getting them thrown in jail. He was very interested in morality and control and order granted by biblical law. He was very interested in creating a godly state, that if you would just fall in line and believe in this God and believe in Christianity, then and our whole the whole country was doing this, then we'd be okay. He would go on to write the Demonology in 1603, which was his personal edict. I don't have it, but it says his personal edict saying, like, there are witches and we need to start doing something about this. Again, it was highly inspired by Queen Anne of Denmark's troublesome sailing excursion. In this demonology, he claims that women in groups are witches, and instead of acknowledging that there are people with intuition or sensitive or magical powers, he claims that all the powers that any of these women have are not of themselves, but they come from the devil. So he starts to denigrate any of the women's power and essentially starts to consider them as vehicles of Satan and not as healers or folks that are blessed or sensitive or whatever jargon you want to run with that. But taking power away from the peoples, particularly women, and assigning it to the devil. He creates the King James Version of the Bible, just like I said, and disperses it across the kingdom in state-supported Christian schools in order to kill Gaelic or Gallic culture. There's a couple different pronunciations there. But that was his point. He was like, all right, now that I'm the head of the church, we got to crush out anything that threatens me, and we're going to do it through the Bible, and my name on it, King James Version. There was the Witchcraft Act of 1535. Now, it is an extremely vague act. Gives folks that want to accuse people of being witches with a lot of power because of its vague language and ambiguity. most of the accused witches weren't actually any of these healers or these folk sort of spiritualists that I've mentioned earlier. Most of them were ordinary people. The one thing that they were thought to have in common was something called smedum, which was spirit and metal and resourcefulness and quarrelsome. Maybe they were argumentative or opinionated, but these were all qualities that he felt went against the ideals of femininity, that women should be seen but not heard, they should not have opinions, they should not really talk back to anything, talk back to anyone. Now, what that wound up looking like were the women that they predominantly went after, and it was not just women, but it was 80% women. Some scholars argue that 20% that were men were arguably homosexual, um, which we have no real proof of that. But the Anti-Sodomy Act was filed by King James right at the same time, so we have anti-homosexuality, anti-women having opinions or autonomy, and then of course he's out to get Gaelic culture, which was the non-Christian folk culture of their time. Now, these women were over the age of 50, most of them. They were older, not all, but lots of them. Again, they were urban, poor, uneducated, illiterate. Most women, most people were not literate at this time. The men were, but the women were not. And the men that were educated did so because they have the privilege of money behind them. The women were typically unmarried or widowed or otherwise living alone. Maybe their kids had all grown up. Maybe their husband had died, sailing. Maybe he died, fishing, sailing, out on the farm. All that manual labor, as I described earlier, that's tough. That's tough work. And it was not uncommon for men to die in their professions or in the field and farming. Now, again, these women were nonconformist, non-social, non-ladylike, non-Christian women. They probably didn't want anything to do with Christianity. They had their beliefs. They were not trying to go in town and raise a bunch of hell, but if anyone tried to force anything on them, they didn't want it. They came from generations of either Celtic or Gallic beliefs, and they simply were not interested in becoming Christianized, and especially under the pressure of a king. So at the high level, we have power hungry, paranoid King James VI. Okay, so at the very top level, you've got a guy who believes in witches, who's against homosexuality, who's against Gaelic culture. He is on a quest to make a godly state now that he is in charge. You have poor harvests and health, the second wave of bubonic plague at the commoner market level. Competing religious pluralism plays a massive role. Which worldview will win? Will it be the Anglican Church or will it be the Calvinists? Will it be the state versus the local person? Who will stand out as the most devout and pious? Who will control societal morale? And what does it mean to be Christian? Now that the Catholic definition has gone away, they were trying to essentially, I'm more Christian than you are. No, I'm the real Christian. No, I'm following the real Jesus. And we start to see splits on what it means to be Christian starting here at the Protestant Reformation. You have an existing belief in witches. This was not a new enemy. This was not a new concept. You already had the groundwork for magic and witchcraft. The gender roles of Calvinism and Presbyterian and Baptist and Puritans were very strict. There was a lot to, men wanting power in the home life and in the political sphere. This was echoed by King James VI at the top level. So there are a lot of agreements on how things should be unfolded. And it was mainly both of them didn't care for women and they didn't care for non-Christians. They didn't care for homosexuality. They definitely didn't care. In fact, they wanted to rid Scotland of it. And this is where we are. We have the Presbyterians and the Calvinists that executed witch hunts at more frequent occurrences during times when the conflicts between the state and the Episcopal, the state and the Episcopal Church. So Whenever those two would clash, women would suffer. There were accusations of infertility, sexual dysfunction, injury, financial hardship. There was this whole level of personal vendettas that were going on by the locals. For example, of all sorts of things. The famine. It's because we have witches. My business isn't making money, and it's because of the witches. That kind of rhetoric. So we have this civil unrest. We have this clash of morality and worldviews with a focus on Christianity and what it means to be the most Christian at the local level. At the high level, you have someone that is validating all of this, that is trying to do this and have his own form of control. With the fall of the Catholic Church, you also have a competition of recruitment of believers. You have all these different denominations and churches trying to recruit people, come join, come join, come join. And this is why you should join us and not them. And witchcraft was a notable political issue at the time. This is how we feel about witchcraft. Come join us. The competition amongst clergy too. There were ministers and pastors, reverends that were also trying to be seen as, the egos of them are playing out. Are they speaking enough to these issues that the public is deciding are very pressing? And then, of course, when you have all these denominations, when you have all this going on, you're going to have religious extremism, these factions forming, needing to be seen as not only the most righteous in alignment with their faith, but also who's the most loyal to the king, who can show the most loyalty to hierarchy and order, who understands how social morale should be ran. That is all going on right then. Again, there was no legal definition of witchcraft or witch, not a serious one. That Witchcraft Act was very vague, very ambiguous. It left a lot of room up for interpretation. The commoners believed in magic and folk traditions and saw witchcraft as power from the woman or the person. They were fine, for the most part, with these folk magic, folk healers, the herbs and spices and incantations. That was part of kind of their culture. But now that those powers are being demonized, instead of that coming from the people, it was coming from Satan. Again, these fouled satanic vehicles of dark magic that these women were. They had been tainted by the devil. The nobles and even the king were still accepting of witchcraft. And throughout this time, they would still allow uh, astrologers or folk medicine, folk healers, spiritualists to come in and provide healing or fortune or whatever they were looking for, but so long as they, before they went in about their services, they confessed that they were Christians. They acknowledged the validity of Christianity as their main power, and as subsequently with the Christianity, they were acknowledging that it is the state that is in charge, right? Because the state and Christianity are one at this point. So you could continue to practice your powers, but you had to acknowledge that this was something that was additional, not your primary, and that your main belief system was in Scottish kings and the Scottish royalty and Scottish bishops in the Christianity of Scotland. Now, how they justified this with scripture was this specific term, Exodus 22:18, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. This was their rally cry. This bit of scripture in Exodus, in the Old Testament, or if you call it the Hebrew Bible, was their justification. This was how they were going to wrap God and Jesus and the Bible all up in this, was thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Now, the hero hunters, um, folks that were hunting the witches, were considered celebrities. They were getting paid lots of money, lots of notoriety. They were celebrated, parades, considered like aspirational people for young boys to look up to. One day I'm going to be a witch hunter and rid the world of evil. It created a following, it created copycats. It was very lucrative, that lent itself to fraud, and we'll find out that most of it was fraud, all of it was fraud anyway. But again, these hunters were not just like backwoods folk. These were clergy, these were lawyers, these were authorities in society, um, that were being celebrated for going after and killing women, or going after and claiming that these women were witches. So we'll get into their methodology here in a second. Now, I got this off Amazon. It is on my Amazon storefront at the very end of this lecture. But this is the Malleus Maleficarum, The Witch Hammer by Heinrich Kramer. It is the manual. You can see I've tabbed it up quite a bit. It's the manual written by a German lawyer who accused a person of witchcraft in Germany. He lost and said, now that I've been through the process, this is what I would have done. This is how I would have proven my point, and published his notes and therefore circulated them across Europe, making its way into Scotland. The book also contains interrogation questions to promise a guilty verdict. If you ask these things, if you set up the conversation towards this way, this is how you will get a guilty verdict. Now, ultimately, people were being hung. There were the gallows. There was a guillotine. There were other ways um, to take someone's life, as particular criminals back in that day. But for him, you had to burn or purge these witches so that they would be extinguished from the earth. That was optimal for the riddance of evil that these women were carrying around. It was not enough to just hang them or take them to the guillotine. You needed to burn them alive. Some of the questions that are included in this book is, how did you transport to fulfill magical tasks? How did the women copulate with incubi and the devil? Talk about the devil's genitalia. In fact, that was a major thing, was that these women had been seduced by the devil, and in exchange for the seduction, they were either cursed, given these powers, and their questions were all about that, including, how can you remove male genitalia? What threat to the man are you after sleeping with the devil? How did you control the weather? How did you control livestock? How did you become possessed? All these types of questions. Now, you may be thinking, what person in their right mind is going to be able to answer any of that? Those are very insane questions. But what they would do in their interrogations, again, this major focus on intercourse with the devil, intrusive questions about imagined devil sex. Lots of them were guided questions about devil's pact. What pact do you have with the devil? What are you doing hanging out, under the moonlight? What are you doing by the wells? What are you doing by the rivers and the creeks? What activity have you participated in fertility or birthing, or spells or animals? Just any bit about normal life became subject to questioning, because now these were, accused people of having devilish powers, being around, um, birthing or animals or water sources or being out at night. There was a lot of questions about the renouncement of Christianity. Do you renounce Jesus? Do you renounce Christianity? Is that what the devil made you do? Were there other women involved? And then this intense pressure to name other women, to say, like, there's no way that the devil could have come by our village and only taken you. Who else could they have possessed? The men that were accused of witchcraft were not asked sexual questions, unfortunately. And the reason why we know any of these questions, because this was due process. This was formal, legal, again, carried out by clergy, lawyers, judges. So we have quite a bit of information from the legal proceedings, because they wrote all of this down. This was documented as fair and ethical legal process. And then finally, the denial or the retractions at names of execution. When these women were brought to the stake to be burned with their final breath, they maintained their innocence, knowing that nothing, there's no going back, nothing else. And to which folks would argue, like, oh, well, that just, they're trying to get out of it. At this point, they were not. The fire had been the torch had been burning, but they were trying with their last breath to say, no, I'm innocent. This is fraudulent. This isn't right. Um, Furthermore, some folks would argue that if they really were devil possessed witches, wouldn't they, in their final breaths, pray to their God? Wouldn't they pray to their devil to come and save them from being burned alive at the stake? So there's a lot of how do I want to say it? The point that these women were denying being witches and were maintaining their innocence right until their last breath is pretty telling that these women had nothing. They weren't guilty. Like, so let's talk about jail. What was legal? All these questions were legal. And again, you might think those questions are crazy. How did they get away with it? How did women not just sit there and deny it all day long? Well, again, these women were not literate. They couldn't read, so they would be jailed without bail, sometime up between 6 to 9 months, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer, but they were in there for a while. And the main form of torture that these men would do was sleep deprivation. They would keep women up 3, 4, 5 days at a time to the point where women are hallucinating, where they are like getting sick. They are having serious brain fatigue, even like brain thought cognitive failure being awake for that long. And then they would ask them all of these questions under the hallucinations of sleep deprivation and then have these women sign the confessions. Um, they would be starved and shaven, defeminized, dewomanized, dehumanized. They had bondage and torture tools. We'll get to that in a second. Physical and sexual assault were legal, or at the very least not criminalized. So in the sleep deprivation, there had to be a jailer sitting in her jail cell to make sure she didn't fall asleep, and he could keep her awake in any way that he saw fit. And it was perfectly legal. You might even have 2 or 3 jailers coming in and keeping her awake through sexual and physical assault. And again, most of the torture, just like the questions, were sexual in nature. You have these pricking. Pricking was another form of discovery, as lawyers would call it. You have these all male group inspections of accused body for the devil's mark. They would take women individually. A group of men would come into her jail cell, take her out into the main chamber or wherever they are conducting this interrogation, stretch her out on a table, chain her wrists and her ankles, and strip her naked, right? She's already been shaven, so she's just stretched out naked on a table surrounded by men. And they would inspect every inch of her body looking for the devil's mark. They would take needles and prick and prick and prick until an area did not bleed and no pain was felt. So a woman was undergoing needle pricking up until they probably hit some fatty tissue like the buttocks or the arm or somewhere that you could poke and maybe not bleed as much or no pain was felt. Some of our more insensitive areas on the body. And once they found an area that didn't bleed, that was considered the mark of the devil. And it was even better if that mark or that area also had a mole or some other kind of blemish. Now, the main leader of this was John Kincaid. I want to say, I can't remember, but it's something like 200 to 350 women that he went and pricked and then came out saying, she's a woman. Now, it would come out later, actually, that we'll see that a lot of people wound up confessing to being fraud. But that, yeah, he himself was he didn't turn himself in, but when interrogated, he admitted Yeah, I actually don't know if pricking was a legitimate way of discovering if a woman was a witch. So even the people that were doing this were just doing it to have a job, to be a part of the cause, to have some sort of power or celebrity. Really sick stuff. You have your legal methods of torture. Now, I'm going to start on the right here, but you see how we have face or head coverings, these almost shackles that go above the face. You see in the top right, or the top right row of this tongue piece. It was a metal thing. They would put a whole bracket over a woman's head, and then in the mouth, they would put tongue pieces so that she couldn't talk. There are a couple of different, here's just the diagrams of them. They might put these brackets over them so like you couldn't see out, maybe you could. Um, and then if they were feeling particularly violent, those tongue pieces could also be spiked. So anything a woman did with her mouth, scream, breathe, talk, cry, whatever, her mouth would be essentially torn to shards. If you move to the left, you see the stretching tool where you would be hung by your wrists and by your ankles, and someone would crank and crank and crank, slowly stretching your ligaments until you were torn literally apart. On the left, we see a woman wearing that one of the head shackles. And then finally, on the top, directly under the title, we see a metal spiked, pointed um, tool, and that was primarily used for vaginal or genitalia insertion. So, again, really sick stuff going on. Here are some pictures of the public. This was, I believe it was on the right. We see a woman on the ladder, and she is being pushed. She is tied to a ladder, and they're just pushing that ladder directly into the bonfire. Um, we see right below, we have heard of witches and essentially being, this was actually from the Salem witch era. Most of this is from Scotland. This picture on the right, the bottom right, is I believe from the Salem witch trials. But this idea that if a woman floated or knew how to swim, she was a witch. But if she drowned, she was a human. At that point, she was dead. So they would tie them to chairs. They would tie them to anchored boulders, rocks, weights, whatever, and then basically say, if you survive, then you're a witch. We have, you see women at the gallows awaiting on the left. You see women all on the gallows with their heads and hands. Um, and then you see men lighting and keeping the fire burning while other women are tied to the stake. So, again, watching other women die this way was common. They said you're going to end up just like them if you don't start confessing, if you don't start doing things. And then the picture in the middle is a group of women in front of the king in his noble court, where men are abusing women in order to confess to their witchcraft. So essentially, there was no getting out of there innocent. You were either going to confess quickly under abuse or under threat of watching other women, or you were going to be tested by being thrown into the water. But there, once you were accused, the odds of you getting innocent and getting released are over. It was pretty much a death sentence. Here are some real stories. Now, this picture is from a real grave or a real burning site of in Scotland of a woman where she was burned. It will talk about how Scotland is treating the legacy of the Scottish witch hunts here in a few slides, but this is from Scotland. It is not my photo. The sources are at the end of the slide. Now, real stories. You have Isabel Grierson. I do not know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. My apologies to any Scottish folk reading or listening to this. I mean this with all respect. She was a folk healer out of town. She had land. Her husband died. She was tending to her garden. Um, Again, she lived outside of town in her husband's property. He died, and she just maintained the property. She was accused of bewitching the local feral cats. When the plague second wave ran through that town, that very highly populated area, she lived away from them and didn't engage. She was already kind of weird for not engaging and going to church, but she didn't want to. She was widowed and didn't care for church. That it's just as common then as it was now of folks just not wanting to be part of church. Um, but she was accused of bewitching the local feral cats because while the rest of the town was dying of the plague and she was away from town, cats, as we know, like to chase mice. Mice carry the plague. So because she had a little protectionist group of plague killers through her cats, they accused her of bewitching those cats with her devil powers. And all she really did was feed them and be nice to them. There is Agnes Sampson. She's an elderly midwife accused of black magic. She was a midwife. Um, and as these accusations unfolded, any time any of the childbirth situations that she was in did not end favorably, maybe the baby was born stillborn, the woman miscarried, the woman died in labor, anything like that, they accused Agnes of being the perpetrator of that through her black magic. Ellen Gray was the best friend to the battered wife of Thomas Riddell. Um, Thomas Riddell wasn't particularly a fan of Ellen Gray, mainly because he was probably concerned that his wife was telling her about what was going on at home. It was not uncommon for men to sleep around or infidelity back in the day, just like we hope that it would not be here. But um, he was an abuser and probably not very faithful to his wife that he abused, and was did the Ellen Gray, the friend, was accused of fatally poisoning Thomas Riddell's manhood. Now, what scholars believe now is that Ellen Gray did nothing to his manhood. His own sleeping around caught up with him, and he died of an STD. That's probably the more scholarly or academic answer to how a woman could what how that played out. And finally, Katie Liddell was accused and tortured, but set free because for some reason her family, her father, more so like it, she came from money and she was able to have a tutor, so she did know how to read and write. And it didn't take her very long when she started, getting into those jail systems to say, hey, I'm going to write to my lawyer. And she wrote and refused to sign any of the contracts or confessions or anything that the local authorities were forcing all the other women to sign because they didn't know how to read and they were just read this, it'll save your life. And she was like, no, it's not, this is essentially ending my life. So she was able to read and write to get a lawyer. So folks, read. Marion Walker. Here we go. So Marion Walker was the defender of women in Glasgow. She takes on Margaret Aiken, which was a female witch finder. She was the so-called Great Witch of Bowery. Sorry again, not very good at my Scottish pronunciations, or Gaelic, Gaelic, whichever. Now, Margaret was arrested for witchcraft, and she tried to save her skin by claiming she could identify other witches just by eye contact. She said, oh no, I am a witch, but I'm a good witch. I'm on your team. I'm trying to kill other bad witches too. And the authorities, including King James VI, saw her as this new super weapon in the war on Satan. Maybe if we can get a woman, a witch on our side, it'll help our cause. Well, Marion Walker didn't believe in any of it. She had seen enough good women be accused and burned at the stake. She thought this was all garbage, and she took on Margaret. So what she did, one day Margaret accused a whole bunch of women of being witches, and Marion went back and brought those women back the next day in different clothing and in a different order. And Margaret did not identify the same women as witches. meaning like you told me this was eye contact, but if I dress them up different in different clothing and I shake up the order, um, but now they're no longer witches, or some of them are, some of them are not. Like clearly, you don't have the gift of eye contact identification. It was a very public display. It ruffled a lot of feathers. And this is when the townspeople and the authorities started to. This was one of the big cases where they were like, oh no, what have we done? What if there's been a lot of women that were innocent and killed because of witchcraft accusations? This was not like, oh, everything changed after this. It did. It picked up speed. But throughout this, there were people that spoke out. There were people that were sowing seeds of doubt to say, like, are we sure? Like, that woman's always been so nice, or I don't think that woman did anything. How is she like this dangerous witch? There was already, it was such like a massive sweep that people were not particularly um, confident going into this, how I should say. Marion held them all accountable. She somehow got her hands on a confession from John Cowper. He was another major witch accuser and celebrity. And she somehow got her hands on a letter that where he was expressing doubt in their accusations and in witchcraft in general, and whether or not that this legislative process was legitimate. So this kind of all ended roughly by 1815. So I said 1500 and 1700s. It was starting to die out pretty significantly, but I mean, even the Witchcraft Act was repealed 1735 formally at the states. So the states already, but things like that tend to take some time. So 1850 is kind of when they say, oh, that was the last of the witchcraft hunts. Ben Franklin did come out with an article essentially saying, like, if you're accusing women of witchcraft, you're accusing people of witchcraft by now, and you believe in magic, you're uneducated. You're clearly not with the times. So there was almost this pushback from academia and from the Enlightenment and expanding academia amongst the aristocracy. So at the beginning, all these wealthy men were going away to colleges abroad. They're hearing about witches over there. They're coming back and they're like, it's a big deal. We got to do something about this. But as academia unfolded, more and more science and history came, um, and the death of magic, death of the supernatural and mystical that came from academia as all these colleges were rising at universities. Suddenly the tune started to change to like, I don't think there's actually witches anymore. I think that's for the uneducated to believe. So it became kind of like a class thing of like, you believe in witches, like. Mm. Um, You also see religious pluralism in colonial America take effect. They also had their own laws against witchcraft. They had Salem witchcraft, and we'll talk about that. In fact, well, that's the next slide. But really, the hunts ended. They started with academia and and their own witchcraft beliefs and kind of getting everyone gathered, and then they also ended as academia unfolded over that 200-year period, combined with religious pluralism. That was like, the more Christianity divided into denominations and got more entangled into intellectualism and again academia, universities, colleges, the more people became educated, the more they started to question what was going on. So the Salem witch trials. So the Salem witch trials were actually carried out by the same Puritans, Calvinists, and Presbyterians that arrived from Scotland. They came to the United States. The Salem witch trials were significantly shorter. They were only about 40 years. And again, those were occurring towards the as academia was expanding. Furthermore, there was a lot more religious pluralism by the time the Salem witch trials were going on. So there were quite a lot of Christians who were like, "Are we sure that this is against our faith to have healing powers or intuition or special powers?" But I thought that was interesting that the folks that arrived from Scotland came to the United States and immediately were like, "There's witches here too. We gotta burn them. We gotta do take care of them." And so it's the same kind of group of people, same beliefs. Now things laid low for a while. A lot of the focus was on expanding the United States. A lot of denominations, the Catholic Church included, the Church of England, Methodists, Baptists, Calvinists, everyone was real focused on slavery and Native Americans and expanding the United States. But we do see that there became this like sort of nostalgia or this retrospection of history and wanting to collect artifacts that emerged really in the 19th and 20th centuries. So by the 1800s, they're like, wait a minute, like let's review some of our culture, let's review some of our history, and torture artifacts were something that became circulated, including witch torture artifacts. Now, going into the 21st century, we see TV shows like Bewitched, where it's a 1960s housewife, and she is allowed to have magical powers so long as she is obedient and subservient to her husband. We hear more and more stories about witches. Um, the major one of quite what I would consider modern day is Harry Potter. You know, Harry Potter exploded amongst the youth, and that really revitalized this belief in witchcraft and celebrity and kind of heroism of, you know, Hermione Granger or Harry Potter or Ginny Weasley, where you've had, you know, kids getting excited about witchcraft, and the Christians, particularly the fundamentalist or the evangelical, were not at all happy with Harry Potter. You have the sexualization of witches. Again, it went from something like, "Oh, that's horrible. We have to burn that. That's evil," to like, "Oh no, like it's, you know, exotic. It's foreign. It's, you know, mystical. It's sexy." That is like a big question mark I have, particularly with all these like jailers and clergy and authority people for going and dehumanizing and sexually assaulting these women that they accused of witchcraft. Because they accused these women of sleeping with the devil, and that's where they got their power. So if the women slept with the devil and you thought that was bad, why would you sexually assault her? Hmm. Doesn't that somehow make you an Eskimo brother to the devil? Now, the green face in culture, there's a couple different theories why. One theory is because a lot of these women were in the woods. It's cloudy, it's foggy, it's rainy, they're elderly, maybe they're haggardly. Um, that is one argument. The other argument is by the time these women were taken from their jail cells out to being burned at the stake, they looked like crap. They looked like they had been beaten, starved, sleep deprived, sexually and physically assaulted using torture tools. These women looked ill. They looked terrible. Weight loss. And again, these were elderly women. Um, you know, there's no Botox and makeup back in that day anyway, not in the way that we have it now. So when you go through what they went through, anybody would look green or yellow or discolored. A funny story about Stevie Nicks is that she developed her witch persona when she was on stage opening for Jimi Hendrix very early in her career. And she watched how Jimi Hendrix had a different personality on stage than he did backstage. And as the story goes, that's where she was like, oh, I need to have a different persona. I need to have this entertainer thing. And, you know, she was just like a young woman. And so she was like, oh, well, on stage, I'll be witchy. I'll be, you know, this sort of mystical, magical. So that's where Stevie Nicks crafted her sort of persona of being witchy, and it called so much attention. It was her brand, people loved it. But at the same time, it brought on all sorts of attention, either from the Christian community, the conservative Christian community, or she would get weird witch stuff in her mailbox, you know, dead rabbit feet or other charms or good luck things that the witch community was sending her. So she finally had to release a statement and say, guys, it's just an act, it's for entertainment. Um, Something to the effect. Now, in 2022, on Women's Health Day, Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, issued a formal apology from the government and owning the horrors of the Scottish witch hunt. So those who met this faith were not witches; they were people. They were overwhelmingly women. At a time where women were not even allowed to speak as witnesses in a courtroom, they were accused and killed because they were poor, different, and vulnerable. So, some political significance here with the Scottish witch hunts. You have the scapegoating during times of political, economic, and social duress, during civil conflicts and leadership distrust. So you have all of these other higher up conflicts going on, distrust amongst society. Let's blame the witches. Let's blame the women. Typically, when conflict of power exists, those who are not in power will suffer the most. I think there's um, a phrase, a cold at the top is pneumonia at the bottom. This religious pluralism shook up status quo. You went from having the Catholic state, that was the state and church were one and the same, and now religious pluralism is shaking up the game. Who is in charge now? Who is the most pious and righteous? Um, who's the devil? All these different things. Who has the right to be here in society? And of course, it was the Gallic or the Gaelic, the women, and the homosexual that they deemed as lesser than, that were not welcome at this new society table. So again, the Scottish witch hunts in the 1500s and 1700s were carried out by religious extremist men in power who used scripture, law, and personal vendettas to legally jail, torture, assault, and kill at least 4,000 women accused of witchcraft. The hunts occurred during a time of religious and social unrest where the competition for power created fear, tribalism, and scapegoating. In short, folks, they didn't burn witches, they burned women. Now, as promised, here is the timeline. For those watching on YouTube, you can pause at every slide. This is from the 1500s. This one covers the 1600s. And this one covers the 1700s. So for folks who like to bring it all together on a timeline, please check that out. Here are my sources that I have used. Again, we have, if you are looking for something that's not so academic, but is fun to read, fun, that's a word, right? But is not academic, but you could read, you have Ashes and Stones by Alison Shaw. She is an American who relocated to Scotland. She is a Scottish woman, Scottish by blood, and she herself went on a journey, a pilgrimage to go learn and follow the footsteps of the witches and the witch hunts. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate this. If any of this resonates with you, go ahead over to my website, Follow the Leader. It's spelled the same as my YouTube handle. You can purchase this for $5. You get all the lecture materials, the marketing, and then this slideshow in Canva and in Microsoft. To deliver to your communities. I want to empower folks. If you feel that this resonates with you, I want to make it as easy as possible for you to go back into your community and give this lecture. My website again is Follow the Leader, and I do have an Amazon storefront with all the books I've used as much as I could. Some of these were articles from University of Edinburgh or Harvard that I couldn't obviously put on Amazon. But if you are interested in further reading, check out my Amazon storefront. That is Follow the Leader. So again, Amazon storefront, Follow the Leader. Thank you so much. Leave comments, share, make sure to follow me on TikTok. Everything is Follow the Leader. It's under the same handle. I really appreciate you being here. And I'll see you next time. Make sure to like and subscribe.